The sea off Normandy on June 8, 1944, was not at peace. The Allied invasion, only 2 days old, had turned the English Channel into a congested highway of warships, landing craft, and wreckage. Amid that chaos, one sleek, gray vessel, the USS Meredith, D-726, vanished from radar without a trace. It was a destroyer built for speed, precision, and protection, a veteran of Atlantic convoys, now serving off Omaha Beach. Yet by nightfall, she would cease to exist, leaving behind a riddle that remains unsolved to this day. The Meredith was part of the U.S. Navy's Destroyer Squadron 60, assigned to provide naval gunfire support for the troops advancing inland from the Normandy beaches. Her task was simple but vital: spot and silence German batteries firing on Allied positions. The ship's 5-inch guns thundered relentlessly, firing over 300 rounds in a single day. Captain Harry E. Hubbard, a cautious yet respected officer, maneuvered his crew through choppy waters filled with floating mines, sunken craft, and constant air alerts. By the morning of June 8th, the weather had turned foul. Heavy seas rolled under a thick fog, cutting visibility to mere yards. Radar operators aboard the Meredith reported ghost echoes, faint contacts that appeared and vanished. To the west, the British cruiser HMS Belfast had just relayed reports of German E-boats prowling near Le Havre. Yet the Meredith's crew had another, more immediate concern: the order that had just arrived. They were to hold position and maintain bombardment readiness, despite worsening conditions and growing risks of mines. Quartermaster Second Class Jack Dalton would later write in his diary, "We didn't understand why we stayed put. Every instinct said move, but the radio said otherwise." The crew obeyed. The engines idled. The destroyer held her station roughly 9 miles off Omaha Beach, her sonar scanning beneath the gray surface. The tension was palpable. Crewmen leaned over the rails, scanning the horizon for Luftwaffe aircraft or periscopes. Below deck, the engine room crew worked in oppressive heat, keeping turbines primed for sudden evasive maneuvers. A sense of unease crept through the ship, an intuition that something wasn't right. Just before noon, a blip appeared on sonar. Faint, erratic, but moving. "Possible submarine contact," reported sonarman 3rd Class Peter Ross. Captain Hubbard ordered a cautious approach. The Meredith adjusted course slightly, her screws churning against the turbulent water. But as quickly as it appeared, the contact was gone. Moments later, radio static filled the bridge. Then silence. Aboard the British minesweeper HMS Bangor, Lieutenant Thomas Redding noted in his log, "Heard a low, concussive boom from the east. Believed to be a magazine explosion or depth charge accident. No distress signal followed." The Meredith had simply disappeared from radar. That evening, as rescue operations began, the grim reality set in. No wreckage, no lifeboats, no survivors were immediately found. Only a spreading slick of fuel oil marked the spot where she was last seen. Search vessels combed the area through the night, guided by signal flares and radio bearings, but nothing surfaced. By dawn, U.S. Naval Command listed the Meredith as missing, presumed lost. The official explanation came quickly: she had struck a mine. Yet, as several officers noted, there were inconsistencies. The coordinates didn't match known minefields, and the detonation pattern, according to later acoustic analysis, suggested something else, something deeper. A fragment of the ship's log, later recovered from the beach, contained one haunting line: "We were told to hold position, though the sea itself rebelled." That sentence would fuel speculation for decades. Was it a routine command gone wrong, or was the Meredith involved in a classified mission hidden beneath the chaos of D-Day? As Allied forces pressed inland, the loss of a single destroyer seemed insignificant in the larger war effort. Reports were filed, families were notified, and operations moved on. But for those who had known the Meredith, her disappearance left a wound that never healed. Ships sink, one officer remarked years later, but they don't vanish. Even today, naval historians remain puzzled. Wartime archives reference the Meredith's final position inconsistently, and some British documents list her as detached for special duty just hours before she vanished. No such mission has ever been publicly acknowledged. The Normandy coast has given up many secrets since 1944. Wrecks, artifacts, even buried aircraft. But the sea still guards the Meredith's resting place. Somewhere beneath the waves lies the answer to one of the lesser-known mysteries of the war. How a modern destroyer, bristling with technology and surrounded by Allied ships, could simply disappear in daylight. As the sun set over the beaches that June evening, the last signal from USS Meredith crackled faintly through the static, holding position as ordered. Then nothing. And that silence marked the beginning of a mystery that would confound naval historians for the next 80 years. By dawn on June 9, 1944, the American and British fleets off Normandy were running on nerves and caffeine. The loss of the USS Meredith was whispered about in the wardrooms, but officially dismissed as an operational accident. Yet, among those who had served with her, the story didn't add up. How could a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of the most advanced of its kind, simply vanish between radar sweeps in waters already swept for mines by British patrols? The Meredith had been part of Task Force 125, operating in the sector codenamed Omaha Charlie. Her orders, signed by Rear Admiral Alan G. Kirk, were to provide naval gunfire in support of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division's push inland towards St. Laurent-sur-Mer. It was a dangerous but routine assignment, the kind dozens of destroyers executed flawlessly in those critical days. Still, that morning, the fleet's radio operators caught fragments of strange transmissions. Short bursts of static-laced Morse code, half of them unreadable. Aboard the USS Emmons, another destroyer in the same squadron, a signalman swore he heard Meredith's call sign, Daisy 726, briefly flicker through the noise, 5 hours after she had been declared lost. Could have been an echo, his superior said, or a trick of the weather. But deep down, many wondered. For those on the ground, the Navy's losses were invisible. The troops advancing inland had no idea that one of their protective sentinels at sea was missing. But for the men still aboard the nearby destroyers and minesweepers, the fear was tangible. They all knew that the waters around Normandy were deadly, not just from enemy mines, but from friendly confusion. Orders were being relayed and countermanded in real time as the invasion's tempo shifted. In the official report drafted later, British liaison officer Lieutenant Commander Hugh Worsley recalled, conditions were deteriorating. Tides ran unpredictably. We warned several American ships they were drifting into recently mined sectors. I distinctly remember the Meredith being among them. Yet she acknowledged our warning and remained in position. That last detail haunted Worsley for the rest of his life. Why would a destroyer knowingly hold in a danger zone unless she had orders? Orders that superseded all others. The next few days only deepened the mystery. Debris was found, yes, but it was inconsistent. A life raft washed up on the beach near Vierville-sur-Mer bore burn marks, but no hull numbering. Some fragments of plating were identified as belonging to a U.S. vessel, but not definitively the Meredith. Then came something even stranger. Sonar sweeps of the area detected no wreckage large enough to be a destroyer. The theory of a mine strike began to falter. Mines, after all, left debris. Survivors. Echoes. But there was nothing. Only oil, with splinters and silence. And yet, someone had survived. 3 days after the disappearance, a Royal Navy rescue trawler recovered 2 men from the water, half dead, burned, and delirious. They were identified as Seaman First Class Andrew Miller and Fireman Joseph Parra, both from the Meredith. Their accounts, however, were fragmentary. Miller insisted the explosion came from below, not from a mine or shell impact. It wasn't German fire, he muttered to medics. It was something we were doing, something that went wrong. The 2 men were evacuated to a field hospital in Portsmouth. Parra died within 48 hours, never regaining full consciousness. Miller's statements were taken by naval intelligence and sealed under restricted classification. Only a summary survived. Asterisk, crewman reports anomalous detonation consistent with onboard test equipment failure. Asterisk, the term test equipment raised eyebrows, but no explanations followed. From then on, the Meredith's loss became a cautionary whisper among destroyer crews. Watch your orders, some would say, and never hold station when the sea says move. The story faded into background lore, another casualty of the invasion's chaos. But years later, a small line in an Admiralty document would reignite the debate. A debriefing report from June 10th mentioned that U.S. destroyer D-726 was engaged in proximity countermeasure trials under coordination with Royal Navy Mine Warfare Division. Trials? On D-Day week. It seemed impossible. The invasion fleet had no time for experiments. Or did it? Some historians now believe that Meredith had been testing a classified acoustic countermeasure, designed to detonate German influence mines before they could harm Allied ships. It was an unproven technology, using sound pulses and magnetic fields. The danger was known, but so was the need. If successful, it could have saved countless vessels in the channel. If it failed, it could destroy the very ship using it. There was no proof, only whispers and a few scattered logs. But one handwritten note in Captain Hubbard's effects, recovered from his family decades later, read, "Hold fast. We're part of something larger." Order sealed. The Admiralty never confirmed the nature of those orders. But by the time the official investigation was closed in August 1944, the Meredith's loss had been written off as cause undetermined. Still, in the silence of the channel, among wrecks that can be mapped and named, one void remains, a gap where a ship should be. The destroyer's last known coordinates lead to an empty patch of seabed. And that mystery, the absence of evidence, the deliberate silence, would soon draw the attention of naval intelligence officers on both sides of the Atlantic, who suspected that Meredith's disappearance might not have been an accident at all. By the third week of June 1944, the beaches of Normandy had become a fortress of steel and supply. Allied troops were pushing inland toward Cannes, and naval fire support was constant. But far out to sea, another battle was being fought, a quiet one, in the war rooms and intelligence offices of London and Washington. At its center stood a question no one could answer. What really happened to USS Meredith, D-726? Officially, the Navy still listed her as lost due to mine detonation. But new reports emerging from the channel were starting to contradict that narrative. On June 15th, the Royal Navy's 2nd Minesweeping Flotilla recorded an acoustic anomaly near Meredith's last known coordinates, an immense underwater echo that suggested a massive explosion had occurred not on the surface, but deep below. Lieutenant Commander Charles Holman, the officer in charge, described it simply. It was as if the sea had swallowed something whole. To the Allied command, this was troubling. If the Germans had deployed a new type of mine, something deeper, stronger, or smarter, it could threaten the entire invasion fleet. Intelligence officers began to suspect the use of the G7ES Zonkenig, Ren, torpedo, a new acoustic weapon fired from U-boats that could home in on propeller sounds. The Germans had used them before with deadly precision. But no U-boat activity had been reported near Omaha Beach that day, and no acoustic torpedo could cause an explosion of such scale. Still, naval engineers wanted proof. So, on June 20th, a joint U.S. British diving team, operating from the HMS Apollo, was dispatched to search the area. Visibility was poor. The seabed was churned with debris from the landings. Yet after 2 full days of sweeping, the divers surfaced with a single piece of evidence, a twisted segment of metal-bearing part of a hull number, 726. It was confirmation that the Meredith had indeed gone down. But where was the rest of her? According to the divers' logs, the seabed was littered with only small fragments, far less than what a 2,000-ton destroyer would leave behind. "We expected to find a ship," one diver later told an interviewer. "Instead, we found what looked like the remains of an accident that shouldn't have been possible." Behind closed doors, Allied intelligence debated a darker possibility, that Meredith had not been destroyed by the enemy at all, but by one of their own weapons. British records, declassified decades later, show that during this exact period, scientists from the Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development were testing a new type of acoustic countermeasure, a device designed to confuse and detonate German mines before they reached their targets. It was a radical system. It worked by broadcasting specific low-frequency pulses into the water, effectively mimicking the sound signature of a much larger vessel. But the power required was enormous, and if improperly calibrated, the resulting resonance could trigger nearby munitions, or even detonate under the ship itself. There is no definitive record that Meredith carried such a device. Yet, in the margins of one Navy operations file labeled Experimental Sonar Projects, Normandy Sector, a handwritten note appears beside her name. Asterisk, device active at 0930. Signal instability reported before loss of contact. Asterisk, it was enough to raise serious questions. Had Meredith been a guinea pig for an untested technology during one of the most critical operations of the war? And if so, why had this detail been buried so quickly? Captain Hubbard's last radio transmission added to the confusion. The decoded message read, "Holding position as ordered. Reporting signal interference. Awaiting confirmation." No reply was ever sent. In a 1958 interview, one surviving radio operator from a nearby ship, Ensign Walter Krantz, recalled that the Meredith's final transmission sounded like someone trying to talk through thunder. He described a loud hum, then silence, followed by a dull concussion that made their own ship's hull vibrate. It wasn't a mine, Krantz insisted. It felt like something tearing itself apart. If the acoustic countermeasure theory was true, the implications were grave. It meant the Meredith had fallen victim not to German defenses, but to a dangerous Allied experiment conducted amid the largest amphibious operation in history. The official inquiry concluded in July 1944 with a familiar verdict. Loss due to underwater explosion, cause undetermined. But privately, Admiral Kirk's staff began a quiet purge of operational logs and communications. Any references to acoustic trials or special equipment were removed. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships later classified the destroyer's final modifications under restricted wartime alterations, effectively sealing the truth for generations. Still, rumors persisted. Some sailors claimed that pieces of Meredith's hull were later found more than 15 miles from her reported sinking site. Others said that captured German officers had heard of an American ship testing noise weapons off Normandy. None of these claims were ever confirmed, but the whispers never stopped. As one Royal Navy engineer later reflected, "We were pushing science faster than reason." Sometimes in war, you learn not by surviving, but by what you lose. The Meredith's loss became one such lesson, one written not in reports or speeches, but in silence. And though the Allied command quickly moved on to other victories, a small group of officers continued to meet in secret, determined to understand what had really happened under those gray waters. Their investigation, and what they uncovered in the months that followed, would take the mystery of the Meredith far beyond the beaches of Normandy, and deep into the shadow world of wartime research. Summer turned to autumn in 1944, and the Allied front in Normandy had moved hundreds of miles inland. But for a handful of naval officers and intelligence men stationed in London and Portsmouth, the mystery of the USS Meredith refused to fade. What began as an administrative inquiry had evolved into something far more troubling, a pattern of disappearances, contradictions, and silence. One of the first to notice was Commander Leonard Foster, a U.S. Navy intelligence officer assigned to liaison work with the Royal Navy. Foster had served on destroyers himself and knew the technical limits of a Fletcher-class vessel. Reviewing the Meredith's final transmissions, he noticed that her reported position didn't match where she should have been providing fire support. She was at least 6 nautical miles east of her assigned grid, a deviation no one had explained. Foster's report, marked confidential, not for circulation, contained one damning sentence. Asterisk, USS Meredith appears to have been operating independently, under direct orders from an unknown command channel. Asterisk, that claim didn't sit well with his superiors. Within days, Foster's office was reassigned, and his access to the Meredith file was revoked. But before he left, he copied one page from the destroyer's engineering log, an entry that read, "Test frequency initiated at 0928. Oscillation abnormal. Order to maintain course received 0932. Structural vibrations reported 0934. Those lines matched the timeline of the explosion almost exactly. Meanwhile, stories began circulating among survivors from nearby ships. Several crewmen aboard the USS Jeffers claimed to have seen the Meredith just before she vanished. She was sitting low in the water, one sailor told a post-war historian. There was a mist thick, rolling off her deck. We thought it was smoke from her funnels. But it wasn't gray, it was white. Chemical almost. Moments later, the destroyer disappeared into the fog. When the mist cleared, she was gone. For years, that detail, the strange white mist, was dismissed as memory distortion. But in 1976, when portions of the British Admiralty's mine warfare archives were declassified, a startling connection emerged. One experimental countermeasure system developed that summer, codenamed Project Halo, used vaporized chemical exhaust to conceal surface reflections from enemy radar and to stabilize sound emissions during acoustic testing. The ship scheduled to trial Project Halo on June 8, 1944, was listed simply as USN Vessel, Destroyer Class, D-726. If true, the Meredith hadn't been where she was supposed to be because she wasn't assigned to fire support that morning. She had been detached to test a classified joint system designed to protect the invasion fleet from the very mines that haunted those waters. The experiment was meant to remain secret, even from most of the crew, and it might have killed them all. A nurse serving at the Royal Navy Hospital in Portsmouth later recalled one of the rescued sailors, Andrew Miller, waking in the ward and murmuring about the incident. He kept saying it wasn't the Germans, she wrote in her journal. He said, "We sank ourselves," the sea screamed. Miller disappeared from official records after that note. His discharge papers were never located. When Commander Foster tried to reopen the file years later, he found the records missing, replaced by a single note. Asterisk transferred to Operation NetGuard archive, not to be reissued. Asterisk NetGuard was a term that appeared nowhere else in the public record. Not in Navy archives. Not in British war files. It was as if the project had been erased. Historians now believe Operation NetGuard was the code name for a broader program testing sonar interference and acoustic mine countermeasure technologies in real combat zones. The Normandy invasion, with its massed fleet and chaotic environment, provided the perfect cover for real-world trials. But it also meant the line between experiment and catastrophe was perilously thin. The emotional weight of the loss was not limited to documents. Letters from the Meredith's families began to reach Congress and the Navy Department, asking why there had been no memorial service, no confirmed wreck, and no detailed account of the sinking. Most were answered with the same printed reply: "Your loved one gave his life in the cause of freedom." The exact circumstances are unknown, or deliberately withheld. As decades passed, those questions only deepened. The Meredith's name was etched into memorial plaques and ship registries, yet her story was absent from official naval histories. Even her captain, Harry E. Hubbard, was mentioned only briefly in wartime records. His final orders, correspondence, and personal effects sealed under national security. One document, unearthed in 1994 under the U.S. Freedom of Information Act, hinted at the continuing sensitivity of the case. It read, "DD 726S operational record remains classified under Joint Allied Agreement due to materials and methods involved. Disclosure may compromise legacy defense technologies." Legacy technologies, developed during World War II and still considered sensitive half a century later. By the time modern researchers revisited the case, most witnesses were gone. The sea, as it always does, had erased its evidence. But one mystery remained unsolved. If the Meredith was lost in an experimental mishap, where was the wreck? Sonar scans in her reported sector found nothing larger than a fishing trawler. And then, in 2004, a French maritime survey team operating near the Baie de Seine detected something unusual, an elongated metallic structure lying 200 meters below the surface, far from the ship's recorded position. Its dimensions matched those of a Fletcher-class destroyer. The discovery reignited the mystery. If the Meredith's hull rested there, nearly 10 miles off her last reported location, it meant one thing. She had been moved by current, by explosion, or by something else entirely. The find would trigger a modern investigation, one that would finally expose what Operation NetGuard really was and why her loss was never meant to be explained. When the French dive team from Cherbourg published its findings in 2005, few expected the rusting silhouette beneath the Baie de Seine to spark an international controversy. But as sonar images of the wreck circulated among historians and naval engineers, the implications became impossible to ignore. The coordinates didn't match any wartime report. USS Meredith, DD-726, had gone down miles from her last known radio position. The team's lead diver, Jean-Luc Garnier, described the scene in his notes. The ship rests at a steep angle, buried partly in sediment. The bow is twisted, as if bent inward by an immense force from beneath. Guns are still trained forward. All hatches sealed. That last detail stunned naval experts. A ship struck by a mine or torpedo should have shown open hatches, crews rushing to escape. But if all were sealed, it suggested the crew had been ordered to lockdown, expecting something, perhaps an internal test or controlled detonation. When the U.S. Navy dispatched observers to examine Garnier's footage, they quickly took interest. The dive team was asked not to release high-resolution scans, pending verification. Within months, the site was quietly designated a war grave, restricting civilian access. Garnier's later interviews hinted at subtle pressure. They didn't want us to ask why she was there. They wanted us to forget she existed. At the same time, a retired U.S. Navy archivist named Ellen Whitaker uncovered a forgotten reference while cataloging wartime communications from the Office of Naval Research. A memo dated July 2, 1944, mentioned Operation Netguard. Phase 1 completed. Full evaluation deferred pending field incident review. Phase 1. Field incident. The timing matched the Meredith's loss exactly. Netguard, she discovered, was a joint Anglo-American project under the Office of Scientific Research and Development, specifically Section 22, which coordinated secret naval countermeasure experiments. Its goal was to test low-frequency resonance technology to disrupt or neutralize German acoustic mines and submarines. Few knew that one of its experimental systems, the WWII array, had been installed aboard a destroyer for live trials. That destroyer was DD-726. For the first time, the pieces began to align. The Meredith had not been lost in random combat. It had been chosen for a secret demonstration, under conditions so classified that most of her crew were unaware of the full risk. The WWII array used twin transducers and a magnetic amplifier to emit alternating frequency waves designed to pre-trigger nearby mines. But the calibration was unstable. When resonance harmonics exceeded threshold limits, the energy reflected downward instead of outward, compressing water pressure under the hull. In simpler terms, the Meredith had detonated herself with her own defense system. Internal Navy correspondence, declassified in 2011, contained one chilling summary from scientists at the Portsmouth Naval Research Laboratory. Field test failed. Resultant implosive effect catastrophic. Recommend termination of Netguard field trials. File under restricted classification, foreign and domestic. No wonder the story had been buried. A cutting-edge weapon meant to protect the invasion fleet had instead destroyed one of its own. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came from the British side. In a letter found in the personal archives of Admiral Sir William Tennant, a key planner of the Normandy landings, he wrote, "American vessel D-726 has been lost during cooperative measures testing. Admiralty concerned over operational secrecy. Joint decision, incident to be classified under standard mine casualty." That decision effectively erased Meredith's true role from wartime history. Her crew were posthumously listed as combat casualties. Their families never told that the ship had been engaged in experimental research. Decades later, those withheld truths surfaced in a 2007 BBC documentary proposal. Naval historian Robert Latham described the cover-up succinctly. To admit that a destroyer was sacrificed in an untested acoustic experiment during the most crucial phase of the war would have been politically impossible. The only acceptable story was a mine. Even today, Netguard's full archive remains sealed. The few documents that exist describe only unsuccessful experimental trials, without naming the vessel. Yet the French sonar data leaves little doubt. The twisted bow, sealed compartments, and absence of external blast damage tell a consistent story. The Meredith's destruction came from within. For those who study wartime innovation, it's a sobering reminder of the razor-thin line between progress and tragedy. During total war, experimentation was relentless and safety secondary. Every success came at a hidden cost. One American naval engineer, reflecting on a Meredith case years later, said quietly, she didn't die in vain. What they learned from her wreck changed how we fight underwater wars. But that doesn't make it right. As the truth slowly emerged, a new question began to take shape. Not just what happened to the Meredith, but why her loss had to remain hidden for so long. Who ordered the silence? And what, exactly, was still being protected after 60 years? Those questions would come to a head in the final chapter, when one last classified file was opened, revealing the full scope of Operation Netguard, and why even today, the destroyer's name still carries a shadow in naval circles. In 2013, nearly 70 years after the invasion of Normandy, a researcher at the U.S. Naval Historical Center stumbled across a misfiled envelope labeled Netguard, Confidential/1944. Inside were 6 carbon-copied pages, brittle with age. At first glance, the documents appeared routine, project updates, equipment requisitions, but one paragraph stood out. It referenced controlled deployment of Resonance Array, DD-726, Normandy Sector, evaluation, inconclusive/vessel lost. It was the final confirmation historians had sought for decades. Operation Netguard was real, and USS Meredith had been its first and only live test subject. The rediscovery triggered renewed scrutiny from naval historians on both sides of the Atlantic. Among them was Dr. Robert Latham, the British researcher who had long pursued the Meredith's story. His 2014 report, Echoes Beneath the Channel, reconstructed the final hours of the destroyer using newly accessible records. The findings were both fascinating and tragic. According to Latham's reconstruction, Meredith's crew had been ordered to maintain position at 49°29'N, 0°52'W, an area already flagged as unstable due to seabed munitions and tidal shearing. The destroyer's engineering crew activated the AIC-9 acoustic array at 9:28 a.m., transmitting low-frequency waves across the sector. 2 minutes later, the array began to malfunction, producing an unstable oscillation. The phenomenon caused a violent pressure differential beneath the hull, essentially creating a vacuum bubble that collapsed instantly. The ship was torn apart from below, leaving no time for distress calls or evacuation. In the words of one classified Navy memo, later quoted by Latham, loss of vessel resulted from experimental system failure producing self-induced implosion. Entire complement presumed deceased instantly. That was the technical truth. But the moral truth was harder to confront. The men aboard Meredith had been unaware that they were participating in a live experimental test. For them, it was another morning on station, another bombardment shift off the beaches of France. None of them knew they were sitting atop an unproven device capable of catastrophic feedback. After the disaster, the Admiralty and the U.S. Navy met in London under extreme secrecy. Both sides agreed to suppress details of the incident. In a joint communique, they decided to attribute the loss to mine detonation during operations. The reasoning was simple. The public, and even most of the military, could never learn that a top-secret Allied experiment had gone fatally wrong during the critical phase of the invasion. The minutes of that meeting closed with one line that still chills historians today. No further field applications of acoustic countermeasure arrays shall be attempted until post-war period. The Meredith's name disappeared from all subsequent development reports. Operation Netguard was quietly reclassified as terminated, and its research folded into post-war sonar and anti-submarine programs. Many of the same principles, resonance mapping, active acoustic pulses, and signal modulation, would later underpin Cold War sonar defense systems. The Meredith's loss, though buried in secrecy, had directly influenced technologies that shaped naval warfare for decades. For the families of the 213 men lost, however, that legacy brought no comfort. They had lived for generations believing their loved ones were victims of an enemy mine. It wasn't until the mid-2010s, when historians shared their findings publicly, that descendants began to learn the truth. In 2017, during a small ceremony in Portsmouth, a plaque was unveiled honoring the Meredith's crew for service rendered in defense of freedom and advancement of science. The words were carefully chosen, acknowledging both valor and tragedy, without revealing too much. Yet the mystery still wasn't fully resolved. Modern sonar surveys revealed that the Meredith's hull lay 10 nautical miles from her designated station. Some experts argue that the implosion force might have displaced wreckage over distance. Others suspect that a secondary detonation, perhaps from the destroyer's depth charges, propelled the ship away from its initial position. And then there are those who believe something else, something more bureaucratic than physical, that the coordinates were falsified, deliberately, to conceal the test area itself. Dr. Latham's final interview before his death in 2020 ended with a quiet reflection. In war, secrets are as dangerous as bullets. The Meredith was a casualty of both. Today, the wreck remains undisturbed, a protected war grave under the French Maritime Authority. The site is off-limits to divers, marked only by a digital buoy on naval charts. From above, it's just another patch of gray sea in the English Channel. But beneath, the twisted steel still holds the echoes of that June morning, when science, ambition, and secrecy converged in a single fatal instant. And so, the Meredith's disappearance, once a whisper in the fog of D-Day, has become a cautionary tale for every generation of naval engineers, that the pursuit of progress, however noble, can sometimes sink the very ships it seeks to protect. The sea off Normandy keeps her secrets well, but thanks to the perseverance of historians and the passage of time, one of them has finally surfaced. The truth of a destroyer that never truly disappeared, only slipped into silence for 70 long years.